So as Jerry mentioned, one of the things we're going to be exploring in this panel is really how the Sustainable Development Goals and this idea and the vision that we've been talking about of smart cities over the last couple of days really come together. So first I'll start with Mayor Benjamin. Welcome and thank you for your time this afternoon. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the most powerful and most important shift that smart cities and this gold rush of smart cities has brought to cities?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'll be a little less explicit in the language I used earlier, but the reality is that cities are the only place where things are actually getting done in America right now, and indeed across the world. We're watching this incredible shift, these migratory patterns of people coming back to urban cores. Indeed, in this country, 85% of our population now lives in cities and metropolitan economies. 89% of our jobs are there. 91% of America's $20 trillion gross domestic product is being created in cities. How is it that we can manage this incredible growth to the maximum benefit of all of our citizens? That's why I'm so excited, I will tell you, about having this conversation around smart cities in this context, talking about smart cities powered by people. How is it we can lever this incredible growth we see happening and use the levers of public policy to ensure that we're not just seeing prosperity in some corners of our community, but making sure that, yes, we want to see all the wonderful advancements in our urban cores, in our center city, our central business district. How do we use our levers to make sure that we are addressing some of the most pernicious and long-standing issues affecting challenged populations all across our city, indeed across every city across the world? The opportunity presented here is downright exciting. This conversation around smart cities. I guarantee if you got 30 mayors in the room and you asked them what their definition of a smart city was, there'd be some hard, objective standards, but generally speaking, I would tell you, just based on who we are as individuals, you're going to migrate towards what our priorities are. And in 201, the issues of equity and inclusion and how indeed we lever up this incredible growth to make sure that the benefits don't just go to those of us who have capital, but certainly those of us who work hard every single day. This is an exciting discussion. Yeah. Advances are happening. We've got to figure out ways in which we can measure how we can accelerate that growth and development to the benefit of all of our citizens as much as possible.
Yeah. So Jeff, at the Knight Foundation, we're thinking a lot about smart cities, partly because we recognize that technology is hitting communities, and our goal is to have a more informed and engaged society. So how do we really do that with all of the things that are happening in community, plus technology, plus misinformation, and all the things that are happening? One of the questions is, what is the organizing framework for the smart city? Is it just an infrastructure play, or is there something else that kind of brings all of the technology together? Do you think the Sustainable Development Goals can sort of serve as a uniting framework for this vision? How can technology help advance some of the development goals that you've put forward?
I'm a believer in this concept of sustainable development being the right concept for our time. And I put it in my title, Professor of Sustainable Development, because I wanted to use every occasion to kind of flash the idea of what this is. Sustainable development basically means you want prosperity, okay? You want the economics to be working. But as Mayor Benjamin said, you want it to be fair and inclusive, second pillar. And third pillar is environmentally smart, which is increasingly urgent, obviously, and increasingly costly if we don't operate in a sane way, which, of course, at the national level, we're not doing right now. I'm sure everybody appreciates that in a few days scattered over last summer, we lost $300 billion of property, not to mention lives, in 3 big hurricanes and forest fires, in Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and then the mega forest fires in California. I'm sure everybody here knows that New York City has in front of it at least $20 billion, but actually a lot more, of infrastructure just to guard against the flooding that's going to come with the rising sea levels in the coming decades, what we saw with Superstorm Sandy. So we have to be environmentally smart, and in an era when the United States is more divided economically than in any time in our modern history, and yet we have all this wonderful technology in front of us, we have to do just what Mayor Benjamin said, which is to make sure that this works for everybody. So that's the idea of sustainable development. I call it smart, fair, inclusive as the three key words. And it's to take a holistic vision of that. Now, happily, although in a fragile way, at a moment of lucidity, which is not so often, the world's governments all came together out of this mix of fear and hope in September 2015 to adopt sustainable development as the global organizing principle for international development and economic cooperation, and they adopted 17 sustainable development goals. And as you heard mentioned a moment ago, not only do those goals span the smart, fair, and sustainable triad, but SDG 11 was highlighted by these national governments as sustainable cities because they know this is where the life is, this is where the real economy is. Right now, worldwide, 55% of the world's population lives in cities, and it's going to be 70% at least by mid-century, in my view. It's going to come even faster than people think, because cities really are the place where you can deliver services, use the new technologies, create decent jobs, give education, and people are, of course, they're flooding into the cities sometimes out of desperation, sometimes out of opportunity, or the combination of the two. But the world adopted this, and my thought is, let's use it. It's, these are globally agreed goals. They make a lot of sense, and I think they work at the city level as well as the national level.
That's great. Mayor Benjamin, I've heard you talk several times about innovation, inclusion, and infrastructure. So very similar to what Professor Sachs just mentioned. The SDGs are a global initiative, but their success is dependent on cities. So as the incoming president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, what do you think are some of the challenges to implementation? And what would you ask of the tech sector to help with in terms of achieving these goals?
Sure. Well, for those of you who may not be familiar with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we've been around since 1932. We are the association of mayors, 30,000 and larger, 1,400 cities strong. And every single day we're advocating in Washington and from coast to coast and sometimes globally on the issues of importance to American cities. Our terms, my term just started on Monday. But terms last sometimes a year, just over a year. And most presidents have been presidents just for 1 year, except for Mayor LaGuardia, who served a decade as president. The reality is that of the 17 goals, you can pick any one of them. American mayors are working on several of them every day of the week, from California and Sam Liccardo to Catherine Pugh in Baltimore. Mayors doing some pretty thoughtful and innovative things and facing significant environmental challenges in Miami and other places. But our focus on innovation, on infrastructure and inclusion is just very real. The reality is that 75% of American infrastructure now is being delivered by cities and state governments. The federal government has fully divested itself on delivering American infrastructure and water and sewer infrastructure. In 2016, over 98% of all of our infrastructure was delivered by state and local governments. The other 2% from the federal government came in the form of loans. It's like that across the entire landscape. So our job has been to protect the tools that we use to deliver American infrastructure and also to completely rethink how we deliver that infrastructure. We are issuing this year in our city our very first green bonds, focusing on delivering good green infrastructure in the wake of our 2015 flood that cost us 19 lives and billions of dollars worth of damage. It was an interesting opportunity in the American South, often not a place you would think of for environmental advances, to have a unanimous vote of our city council to issue long-term debt to the tune of almost $100 million to address the need to build resilient infrastructure, and then to be even more thoughtful about ways in which we can have our entire population working on building that infrastructure, giving people jobs and trades and skills that help build families and build communities. Obviously, I believe the tech sector can help in so many different ways. I would encourage all of you in this room. There's so much wealth and the wealth of knowledge. I will tell you, every time I'm in the room with Dr. Sachs, I feel like my IQ goes up 20 points. I feel that much smarter. But the opportunity to deploy your products and services, your ideas, but also marrying them with the ideals of America's mayors. Every single one of our mayors ran for office on one issue or another, but there's something that drives that mayor. And I promise you, it's certainly driven by here, but it's more so driven by here. Being able to marry up your products and services with that mayor's priorities, their values system. And I guarantee you they're all covered in the 17 SDGs. Spending a little more time, as opposed to just selling our products, spending some time understanding what makes that mayor tick will help us deploy these goals in a much more meaningful way over a shorter period of time. And obviously the third I it goes without saying, is inclusion. Understanding that the way in which many of us may see the world is not the way so many of our citizens see it. Understanding that the big decisions are made around a big round table, and listening to each other and dialoguing with each other in a world that seems increasingly distant. Social media has allowed us to have both anonymity and reach, and we say some things that we'd never say to each other 10 or 15 years ago when we had to be accountable for our words. We're yelling at each other. We're not talking to each other. We're not dialoguing and agreeing to work together on the things that we agree on, and those things we can't work on, we'll push those down the road a little bit. But a focus on the three I's will be our focus over the next 2 years, over the term of my presidency and my successor. We determined it was smart to have a bipartisan approach on our very worst day. We're bipartisan, usually we're nonpartisan. We're just advancing the issues of interest to American families and trying to serve as a global leader.
That's a great segue. So one of the things that we've been exploring at night is how we really focus on a smart city that is people-centered, solution-oriented, right? Not just technology for technology's sake, but really connected to our local values and ideals. This is a question to both of you. What do you think is needed to drive higher or just deeper local engagement around whether it be the Sustainable Development Goals or even smart cities? Because one of the things that I think to your point we see is that people are so disconnected and they are dealing with so many challenges. So from your vantage point, how can we do a better job of engaging, the average person in the city on these issues?
Sure. Well, again, I think it begins with dialogue and being people-focused and people-centered. The reality is that you can be the most tech-savvy city in the world. If you're not an inclusive city, if you're not speaking to the if you're not a resilient city, if you're not a sustainable city, then you're really not a smart city at all. If you aren't finding ways in which to help manage the very special and finite tax resources available to you, if you aren't leveraging private sector capital to help meet public sector goals, then you're just not a smart city. I believe it starts first with some very intense engagement with our municipal leaders, with our city leaders. One of our initiatives this year at the conference is trying to develop a cohort of mayors. I believe over the next year and a half, that can range from 35 to 60 or plus mayors, intensively working to define, yes, all the objective infrastructure that we need to become smart cities, but all of the other helping us. The reality is that in our cities, guys, on any given day, you can be dealing with a police shooting, you can be dealing with a flood, you can be dealing with a traffic issue or a homelessness issue, any number of issues that might distract you from the long-term goals established here. I want to create, I dare say we're not subject matter experts, but I want to be able to create, as close as you can, subject matter experts on these issues with a strong cohort of mayors that can then help all of us, I think, quite frankly, catch up with some of our colleagues in Asia and in Europe who are doing some amazing things against some very challenging headwinds as well. But it takes intimate contact. Our leadership from the U.S. Conference of Mayors and several of my colleagues are here today. We're engaged. We're thankful for this opportunity. And I think as you all step in and engage prospective customers in the cities in which you operate, I really want to encourage you to also listen to what that mayor's priorities are. Why did he or she run for office? What did he or she run to change? And then figure out how you can help those issues be resolved and become a reality. And I think we'll find some major synergies much sooner rather than later.
Dr. Sachs, any thoughts?
I think one of the effective ways that I would add is thinking ahead in a systematic way. One of the things that New York, I think, is doing very well is the annual planning around the One NYC, which is our sustainable development plan for the city. It's mandated by the city council. The city government works very hard on it. It's very substantial in content, quantitative, mapped, thoughtful, and forcing a lot of deliberation around the city for the green areas, future of transportation, building codes, education, healthcare, and so forth. And the Sustainable Development Goals are set specifically for the year 2030. The Paris Climate Agreement is set to the year 2050. And this is for a reason, which is that we need to learn once again to think ahead long enough to build infrastructure, to make deeper plans, longer term change. And we're not getting that in DC. We're getting extremely short-term reactive politics, obviously. We're not getting plans. We didn't get it, by the way, this is now several administrations. We've not really built infrastructure in this country for decades. And to build infrastructure is not to say, I want to build something. To build infrastructure is to think hard about the future and what it is you need to build, and then a lot of deliberations to figure out the placement and the land use and the community engagement in order to make that possible. So this is where I think these issues really come in. And what needs to be smart in terms of the tech piece of this, let me just mention a couple of aspects of this. And by the way, what should the tech industries do? The first thing they should do is pay taxes, honestly. And if Amazon, if its second headquarters, when announced, is based on some massive giveaways, we need to have a massive protest, because that company is richer than any in the world. The last thing it needs is local benefits draining away and playing a game of playing the cities against each other. So we need to stop that very bad behavior by the richest person in the whole world, by the way. Let's have some responsibility. This is I can say that because I'm not trying to attract Amazon headquarters to my home, but it's true. Okay, now, what is smart in terms of technology and what do we need? One thing I would say is all our cities are going to have to be all electric cities in the future. We should plan on that. The internal combustion engine is coming to an end. We are going to be driving electric vehicles of some kind in the future because the climate can't stand anything else. So we have to make the shift. We have to make the shift to renewable energy. So every city should be asking, where is my renewable energy, or where is the grid that's going to carry clean energy to me? We just released a study a couple of weeks ago, my team, on how to link New York City with hydropower in Canada, because there's a tremendous synergy, actually, of zero carbon energy possible if you look at the northeast of the US and Quebec and the vast hydro potential. But every city needs to be looking all electric, heating, cooling, driving, especially transport, mass transport, clean energy, zero carbon energy. This is the starting point. And then what SMART also enables us to do, but we haven't really figured it out fully yet, is to make the cities operate in a highly effective manner. Transportation flow, transport safety, autonomous driving. It will come. It will be the norm. 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, we need to plan, build for it, test it in certain parts of our cities right now, because we're moving in that direction, for sure. Our smart grids can improve massively the healthcare delivery and lower costs tremendously. You know, we pay twice as much in this country for any health delivery as any other part of the high-income world. And there are many aspects of that, mainly monopoly power. But one way to get this down is through tech. And we have a lot of improvements of healthcare that can come through smart, citywide public health provision. And I would say in my own sector, in education, the universities are also vastly overpriced. And with smart education, it should be possible to enable every young person. You can get an education at $5,000 tuition. You don't need $50,000 and student loans up to here that are going to smother you for the first 20 years of your life, if you're lucky to get out of them ever. But use tech to get a much lower cost delivery of education and skills. So this is another area where we can be smart and effective. And Mayor, you said it exactly right. One of the things that's happening, which we do not feel fully, and I can just report back on a visit from China, boy, are they moving on these issues very, very fast. Fascinating things happening. I spent a day in Huawei, which in our tech fights we're trying to keep out of this country. I think it's a big mistake and a big protectionism. But they're leading on smart cities all over China. Very clever, very innovative technologies to make the garbage, the waste management better, the public health, the emergency response systems, and many of these other features. And so a lot is happening, and we want to make sure we're running and delivering also. One final point I would make on this, which is use your universities, because every city, Columbia, South Carolina, and New York City, and all our great cities have wonderful universities, and they need to be pulled into this. You are responsible for helping think through the solutions here, because sometimes they think that's not their role, but it's got to be a key part of, and that'll bring business and many solutions in as well.
Those are great ideas. What do you think, and as a funder now, I also kind of position this as like what the role of philanthropy could be in all of this, but what do you think is the thing that's holding us back? What's that missing piece to kind of really make advancements on this in the US, especially as we see other parts of the world, as you say, just moving light years ahead of us?
Well, no, I'll answer and then I'll let Dr. Sachs follow up. There are a number of cities piloting a number of different efforts around building smart, sustainable, resilient, just, and equitable cities. Many of us are engaging in great fiscal management in order to deliver these. Our city, we've finished 5 of the last 7 years with a budget surplus in our city. We have not raised taxes. We've invested heavily in our infrastructure. We've to the tune of almost $1 billion. We work closely with our partners, NGOs, in a regional manner to try and use, again, the levers of public policy to try and meet some of our most incredible challenges. It makes no sense to us that in South Carolina, in our state, that the challenges we face on maternal and infant child health, that if you're born in South Carolina, this year as a black or brown child to have less of a chance of meeting your first birthday as a child born in Libya or Panama or in Cuba or Botswana. That ought not happen the wealthiest, most powerful democratic nation in the history of the world. So we're focusing on trying to address those significant public health issues. It's been a bit more of a challenge doing some of those things at times in the democracy, where there are a number of wastes, a number of different legitimate tensions as to how you focus limited resources in those areas. In some other places where there are monarchies or other types of central control. Yeah. But I will tell you, it'd be a whole lot easier if we had some great partners. And I think even with the federal government AWOL on many of these issues and our state governments as well, I think it presents a fantastic opportunity for our philanthropic partners who recognize how smart and thoughtful cities can help us lead the way to a much brighter future. Those that have long-term patient capital, we can model out some ideas in specific cities that we can then replicate all across America. Knight has been fantastic in our city, a fantastic partner, helping us turn our city into a much more walkable, bikeable, healthy city, focusing on placemaking, recognizing not just the importance of millennials, but also the importance of attracting and keeping perennials in our city. Our 50-plus population, if they were their own country, would have the third largest GDP in the world, over $7 trillion. And recognizing that the experience and assets that becoming an age-friendly city also means to a community. Those types of philanthropic relationships will help us get to where we want to get to with or without a partnership from the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Great.
We got to support the mayor's conference, don't we? This guy's incredible. And by the way, we've been extraordinarily lucky to have two great mayors in a row as head of this, because Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans, who's rightly a legend and a fantastic person, did a fantastic job, and now Mayor Benjamin. And it's really important that...
I gotta figure out how to be a legend when I leave this office, guys.
That's it. You're doing it. You're doing such a great job. I think that how do we get this? Since I'm the oldest person on this stage by far, I'm going to just mention that when I was growing up, there were two big issues in my childhood. One was something called the interstate highway system approach, which was a national effort. It started in 1955, the year after I was born, and it continued through many presidents because we were thinking long term. And then my childhood was very much engaged with the coolest thing ever, which was the moonshot. And that was also, here's where we need to go. And President Kennedy said, I recommend that our nation take the challenge that we put a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth by the end of this decade. And everybody stood up and said, that's great, we'll do it. And the US did it. And so that kind of goal setting, where do we want to be? What are we going to do? Not duck our heads on climate and all this nonsense to try to keep alive 19th century industries or 20th century industries when we need to have 21st century, and we got them in front of our eyes, what we need to do. And then think about it in a longer term way. How is it that Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Carter, all were part of the interstate highway system? Everyone kept going along on a plan that went through all the different across the parties, across the administrations, across the crises to get the job done. And that's a lot what we need to do to make this transformation now.
Yeah. Well, we have just a couple seconds to wrap up, but I thought we'd end on an optimistic note. I'm a tech optimist, so what are you two hopeful about in all of this? I mean, we're at the Smart Cities Conference. You're asking of technologists to do more for sustainability for the planet. But where are you hopeful? Where do you see the positive?
Let's continue to enhance the dialogue, the idea sharing. I mean, we are at the center of the wealthiest, most powerful democratic nation in the history of the world, and I think if we focus on ways in which we can elevate every sector of our community, I believe we can do some incredible things. We're in a bit of a rough patch right now in some respects, but every president that Dr. Sachs just mentioned worked closely with the U.S. Conference of Mayors over the arc of our 80-plus year history. We hope that you will also choose to do so, and working with your mayors in your respective communities, we can do some great things together.
Great.
Amen.